Hi folks, my name is Phil and welcome to Grounded, the series which looks at airlines of yesteryear. This episode will take a look at Kiwi International Airlines, which like Pride Air in our previous episode was started out by some grounded flight crew. Kiwi International lasted far longer but had a much more turbulent journey, so strap in as we take a look at the Kiwi International story. A Kiwi is a flightless bird and was a very suitable name for a group of former Pan Am and Eastern Airlines employees who set about reviving their flying careers. Most were casualties of Frank Lorenzo's takeover of Eastern in 1986. Not long after Lorenzo's Texas Air Corporation took over the airline, things were thrown into disarray with cost-cutting, redundancies and strike action. Just like when Frank Lorenzo acquired Continental 2 years previously, a number of employees were kicked out into the cold. Bob Iverson was the director of training at Pan Am's shuttle division, having joined there following 19 years at Eastern. Iverson led a small group of pilots into forming the Kiwi Acquisition Group, named for the previously mentioned flightless bird, and proved that even when things are looking grim, it's good to have a sense of humour. Iverson, taking the position of CEO, was aided by another former Eastern pilot, Dave Bell, who took on the role of Vice President of Strategic Planning. Bell's brother, Cody, a consultant with the accountancy firm Arthur Anderson, joined as Chief Financial Officer. Doug Stratton, another former Eastern Airlines pilot, took the position of Chief Pilot. The Kiwi Acquisition Group, with the aid of an outside investment company, managed to raise $100 million, and it made a formal bid for the Pan Am shuttle. Just like Eastern, the once mighty Pan Am was in deep trouble, and over the previous few years had been selling off assets in a desperate attempt to survive. The Pan Am shuttle operated a fleet of Boeing 727s on a high-frequency schedule between Washington, Boston and New York's LaGuardia Airport. Ironically, Pan Am had acquired the shuttle operation from Frank Lorenzo's New York Air when the latter had been forced to sell for competition reasons after Lorenzo acquired Eastern. The shuttle was one of the few remaining profitable parts of Pan Am and would have been a fine acquisition for the Kiwi Group. However, they lost out to Delta Airlines. Delta paid $113 million for the shuttle operation as part of a much larger $1.7 billion deal, which would see the airline taking on a large portion of Pan Am's assets and routes. Not ones to give up, the group found new backers and made a bid for the struggling Midway Airlines. That deal was scuppered when the much larger Northwest made a move, leaving Kiwi out in the cold yet again. In a cruel twist of fate, Northwest, having muscled in on the takeover, pulled out, causing Midway to cease operations the following day. Undeterred, the Kiwi Group set about acquiring the West Coast-based Air Resorts in order to use their Air Operator Certificate. This plan was abandoned, however, for two reasons. It was not going to be as simple as morphing the airline into the Kiwi vision, and more importantly, Air Resorts was acquired by Air LA. Several officials in the FAA and Department of Transportation, having been impressed with the group's professionalism, suggested that they start their own airline from scratch rather than acquire an existing one. This did make a lot of sense. An existing airline would no doubt have some financial issues, and of course there would be the risk of being outbid by a larger carrier. With this, the Kiwi Acquisition Group became Kiwi International Airlines, and the company would be based in the Hemisphere Centre in Newark, New Jersey. Startup capital was raised by its future employees, with the buy-in price dependent upon their job role. 46 pilots invested $50,000 each, while flight attendants and ground staff paid around $5,000. Bob Iverson himself also invested $100,000. With this, the new airline managed to raise around $7 million, which, whilst far lower than what they had previously raised, was enough to get Kiwi into the air. Kiwi would operate a fleet of Boeing 727 trijets. While these were more expensive to operate than the 737, they were more readily available, and more importantly, most of the Kiwi pilots were already trained on this type. By selecting the 727, Kiwi were also taking advantage of much lower leasing costs. Due to the recent collapse of both Pan Am and Eastern, there was a large number of 727s on the market. The leasing companies were more than happy to halve their fees if it meant the aircraft were back in use, so those 727s were costing Kiwi just $50,000 per month, which was well within their budget. The 727s would be fitted with an all-economy cabin, however Kiwi were doing things differently. Their aircraft would have just 150 seats instead of the more standard 170, and therefore gave everyone more legroom. The onboard service was different too. Meals would be provided, or on shorter flights, a snack. Despite the higher standard of service, Kiwi would offer very low fares, up to 60% less than the competition. Their tickets had less restrictions and more flexibility too. There were no minimum stay requirements or the need to purchase a round-trip ticket, both of which were fairly common restrictions on low-fare tickets with the major carriers. Kiwi really did pride itself on being better than the rest. A promotional pamphlet even went as far as saying, "Suppose a group of veteran pilots and airline personnel and got together and said, 'We can run things better than this,' and then they did." Kiwi adopted the slogan, "Fly for less, come back for more," which reinforced Kiwi's low fares and high service standards. Kiwi's CEO Bob Iverson even said at the airline's launch that his employees were professional and savvy as they'd seen 30 years of mistakes. On Monday the 21st of September 1992, Kiwi's inaugural flight departed Newark for Chicago Midway. Kiwi would also operate flights to Atlanta and Orlando. Kiwi seemed to get off to a slow start. Their inaugural flight had just 33 passengers on board, but by the end of 1992 the airline was now operating a fleet of 4 aircraft, with even more expansion on the horizon. In April 1993, Kiwi announced that it had struck a deal with Romanian aircraft manufacturer Romero for an ambitious project. Romero had previously built the British Aerospace BAC-111 under licence during the 1980s. There had been several issues and in the end only 9 aircraft were completed. The history of what was known as the Rombach 111 is for a different day, however. An updated 111, unofficially known as the Airstar 2500, would feature a new glass cockpit and Rolls-Royce Tay engines which would meet new noise restriction requirements. Kiwi placed an order for 11 aircraft with options on a further 5. The price tag was reported at $20 million each, which was well above Kiwi's price range. In exchange for the order, Romero bought a 14% stake in the airline along with a seat on the board for $1 million. The 90-seat 111s would have been an ideal aircraft for Kiwi to use on new routes which might not have been able to support the larger 727. Unfortunately, Romero were unable to raise the $100 million that was required to start production, and thus the Rombach project was dead. Despite that, however, Kiwi went on an expansion drive with 6 more Boeing 727s joining the fleet during the year. Chicago and Orlando were developed into bases as Tampa Bay and San Juan were added to the route network in mid-1993 as Kiwi continued to expand, with West Palm Beach seeing service from that November. During 1994, Kiwi took on 6 more 727s, taking the fleet to a total of 15 aircraft. However, one would leave the fleet in September, bringing it back down to 14. This expansion was causing problems, however. When Kiwi first began operating, it had 200 employees and 2 aircraft operating 6 flights per day. By 1994, the airline now had 1,000 employees, 15 aircraft and over 50 flights a day. Despite reaching an agreement with Britain's Virgin Atlantic to offer connections at Newark, Kiwi was still struggling to fill up their aircraft, and thus Kiwi were losing money and fast. It was going to get worse too when in late 1994 the Federal Aviation Administration discovered a number of documentation issues regarding the training of its newly hired pilots. A result of this was that Kiwi were forced to suspend a number of flights and ground 2/3 of their fleet for 2 weeks while the FAA cleared each pilot to fly. The temporary grounding cost Kiwi a reported $2 million at a time when the airline was already strapped for cash, as Kiwi had reported a $24 million loss for the year. In just its first 3 years of operation, Kiwi had lost $40 million. It was being chased by the IRS for $3 million in taxes, owed another $1.4 million to suppliers, and a further $1 million to the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey in airport fees. That Kiwi had been, shall we say, almost perpetually skint, had not gone unnoticed by the airline's board. Founder and CEO Robert Iverson was ousted in February 1995, followed by both his replacement and his replacement. Jerry Murphy took on the role in June and tried to steady the ship. One of Murphy's first acts was to forge an alliance with Air South. Headquartered in South Carolina, Air South's operational base was actually in Atlanta. The low-fare airline operated a fleet of Boeing 737-200s from Atlanta to Tallahassee, Raleigh-Durham, Miami via Jacksonville and Myrtle Beach via Columbia. Both Air South and Kiwi marketed each other's flights, proudly displaying them on their respective route maps. It was hoped that the alliance would help boost Kiwi's load factors, which were still hovering around the 50% mark. Southwest Airlines were set to go head-to-head with Kiwi during 1996 as they launched flights from Orlando to Chicago Midway. There was some hope for Kiwi though. The airline managed to secure a $20 million financing package from a private equity fund in exchange for a 1/3 stake in the airline. Unfortunately, just as Kiwi received the first instalment, the low-fare airline industry was thrust into disarray following the tragic crash of ValueJet Flight 592. Suddenly, the low-fare airlines were in the spotlight. The somewhat ruthless media didn't make a distinction between the various carriers, as for them they were all one fare target. Kiwi had an impeccable safety record. Well, sort of. It never had an accident, but it did have its previous problems with pilot training. Those same issues returned again in early July when the FAA forced Kiwi to ground 4 of its aircraft. Once again, the FAA had discovered problems with Kiwi's pilot training programs and record keeping. During a 2-week special investigation into the airline, the authorities discovered that 30 of Kiwi's 277 pilots were not properly certified to fly. This was because Kiwi had been using unapproved programs to check them, as well as other training documentation issues. Kiwi's CEO, Jerry Murphy, said that the ValueJet crash was a key turning point in his airline's fortunes. He blamed the intense media and public pressure for forcing the FAA to ground some of Kiwi's fleet. He went on to say that Kiwi had slowly bled to the point where they had to take action, whilst also citing the fairly substantial debt that he had inherited from Kiwi's early years of operations. On September 30th, 1996, Kiwi filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. The airline reportedly had amassed liabilities totaling $55 million. The airline blamed rising debts and the fallout from both the ValueJet crash and the subsequent grounding of the Kiwi aircraft. Ironically, it was the same day that ValueJet returned to the air and was also the day that Kiwi had planned to resume full operations following its partial grounding. Kiwi vowed to continue operating but did have to axe a number of flights, focusing instead on its core routes between Newark, Chicago and Orlando. Just over 2 weeks after the filing, on the 15th of October 1996, Kiwi suspended scheduled flight operations whilst continuing to operate limited charter flights. The airline had been in discussions with Victor Kiam, owner of Remington Products, the shaving products company spun off from the firearms manufacturer. The Kiam deal fell through. However, Kiwi were in discussions with an undisclosed third party in the hopes that they could reach a deal before they were forced to dispose of their assets. By the end of October, a deal had been reached with Wasatch International, a Florida-based investment company which also owned a casino cruise line based in Palm Beach. Wasatch agreed to a $5 million debtor-in-possession financing agreement in exchange for majority ownership of Kiwi. With a rescue deal in the works, it was hoped that Kiwi could resume limited operations by the end of November. The deal was too good to be true, however. After an initial instalment of $100,000 was paid on November the 4th, Wasatch failed to stump up any more cash. Things were looking increasingly bleak for Kiwi. However, their management had suspected the Wasatch deal might fall through, so they had been holding talks with other potential investors. Isbray Holding Corporation, owners of American Helicopter Service, a Newark-based helicopter charter service, as well as a company which imports bottled water from Norway to the USA, stepped in. They placed a $5 million debtor-in-possession financing into escrow to save Kiwi, as well as pledging an additional $15 to $20 million in equity financing. Shockingly, history repeated itself and Isbray also failed to stump up the money to buy the airline out of bankruptcy. Kiwi were facing imminent extinction with the bankruptcy judge ready to order the liquidation of the airline when rescue came from an unexpected direction. Wasatch, who had previously abandoned Kiwi having promised to rescue the airline, was back, and this time they had help. Dr. Charles C. Edwards, an orthopedic surgeon from Maryland, partnered up with Wasatch in their attempt to rescue Kiwi. Some may think that this was an odd choice of partner. However, Dr. Edwards was a pioneering spine surgeon and inventor of several medical devices. He had also led around 30 business enterprises, including medical technology companies and even a steel mill for over 33 years. Reportedly, none of them had suffered any significant losses. The Edwards and Wasatch partnership provided $2.5 million in cash to Kiwi, later investing a further $6 million and allowing Kiwi to resume its scheduled flight operation. The partnership also pledged a further $10 to $20 million in order to acquire a controlling stake in the airline. At the end of January 1997, Kiwi, the almost flightless airline named after a flightless bird, had taken to the skies once again. Kiwi was now a smaller airline. The workforce had been cut with around half of the 1,100 employees recalled to work. The fleet had also been reduced to 7 aircraft serving just Atlanta, West Palm Beach and Chicago Midway from the airline's Newark base. In July 1997, a federal bankruptcy judge approved the $16 million rescue plan proposed by Edwards, which now gave him full control of the airline and allowed Kiwi to exit Chapter 11. Kiwi had picked up an additional 727, taking their fleet to 8, and added flights to Orlando and San Juan to the network. Kiwi also went out west with the introduction of Las Vegas, served from Newark via Chicago. Remarkably, for an airline which had looked on the brink of extinction when it was forced into bankruptcy, it seemed that lessons hadn't really been learned. Jerry Murphy, who was still in position as the airline's president and chief executive, insisted that the airline needed at least 2 or 3 more 727s by the end of the year. He then went on to say that the airline needed to acquire a further 15, yes, 15 aircraft in 1998. The airline was looking at moving over to the Airbus A320 or Boeing 737, with the transition expected to begin during 1999. Murphy added that the next generation 737 was the leading candidate, and right now I'm getting flashbacks to the Eastwind episode, where an airline with no money somehow got their hands on some shiny new Boeings. Unlike Eastwind, it seems that these new aircraft, be it Boeing or Airbus, were out of reach for Kiwi, as by October the airline was debating between the McDonnell Douglas DC-9 or the Dutch-made Fokker F-28. In a Flight International article, Kiwi said that it was looking at 4 aircraft, adding that it needed them for its growing route network. The F-28 was a shorter version of the Fokker 100, an aircraft which was both similar in size to the BAC-111 and also helped keep the Romback variant out of full production, a little ironic when you consider that Kiwi tried to buy the Romback 111 back in 1993. While neither the F-28 or DC-9 would join the Kiwi fleet, the route network certainly grew. Flights from Newark to Boston were introduced, along with Boston to West Palm Beach. Tampa would see service from Newark, Atlanta and Chicago. Seasonal flights from Orlando to San Juan resumed on November the 21st. In March 1998, Aviation Industries was reportedly in talks with Edwards about acquiring a stake in Kiwi. By now, Dr. Edwards owned around 85% of the airline, and he had been looking for other outside backers, and Aviation Industries had previously provided Kiwi with debt investment. The future was starting to look better for Kiwi. The airline revealed that load factors were climbing back towards 60% and was anticipating turning a profit during the July and August period. The return to profitability never came, however. Kiwi lost $21 million during the course of the year. A further blow came in late November when Kiwi's president and chief executive, Jerry Murphy, resigned citing personal reasons. He'd been with the airline since the revolving door debacle in 1995, which saw the original president, Bob Iverson, ejected, along with both his replacement and his replacement's replacement. Following Murphy's departure, Dr. Edwards assumed the role of interim chief executive. The airline's chief administrative officer, Jimmy Player, took over as the interim president. By February 1999, Kiwi were once again in a dire financial situation. The airline had burnt through all of the funding it had received during its various bailouts over the past 2 years. 3 of their 727s were repossessed by their owners, 2 of which made their way over to the UK and joined the Sabre Airlines fleet. Sabre were of course covered in an earlier episode and would later rebrand as XL Airways, an airline where I began my flying career, albeit after the 727s had been withdrawn. Isn't it a bit funny how things are connected sometimes? In order to survive, Kiwi needed to act fast, so in March, Kiwi once again entered Chapter 11. Under Chapter 11, Kiwi were able to set about restructuring the airline, cancelling the leases on most of the fleet, reducing the workforce and trying to become a charter operation rather than a scheduled carrier. The airline was in talks with Pan Am. No, not that one. This one was the third incarnation of the iconic airline. Pan Am 3, as it was often referred to, was owned by Guilford Transportation Industries, a railroad company which acquired the iconic brand from the second incarnation of Pan Am when that collapsed in 1998. Guilford and Pan Am were looking at using Kiwi to form the basis of their new airline. It had the fleet, staff, routes, and more importantly, it was already a certified carrier. The idea was to acquire Kiwi, then merge it into Pan Am 3. To help keep Kiwi operating during its bankruptcy proceedings, the airline was going to receive a $3 million bailout from Guilford and Pan Am. Unfortunately, a huge spanner was thrown into the works when the US Department of Transportation threatened to revoke Kiwi's operating licence. The DOT said that it believed Kiwi did not have competent management and was not adequately financed. To be fair to the DOT, it was hardly a baseless accusation. The DOT gave Kiwi 14 days to respond before it would take action. This meant Kiwi could continue operating in the meantime. Of course, this is Kiwi and nothing is straightforward. On March 24, 1999, just one day after the Department of Transportation's announcement, the Federal Aviation Administration grounded Kiwi with immediate effect. The FAA said that Kiwi were unsafe to fly and cited several safety and maintenance violations which had resulted in Kiwi flying airplanes which were in an unairworthy condition. In one case, Kiwi reportedly flew one aircraft for 2 days in late February without fixing an engine oil leak. There was a lot of confusion regarding both the DOT and FAA announcements, especially considering that the FAA itself is a division within the DOT. An unnamed federal official told the New York Times that the apparent flip-flop was the result of miscommunication within the department. The DOT was trying to draw a distinction between its job of determining an airline's financial and managerial fitness and the FAA's role of overseeing safety. It was just incredibly unfortunate timing that the DOT issued a statement regarding Kiwi's financial and managerial fitness the day before the FAA's several-month-long investigation into Kiwi concluded. With Kiwi grounded, things were once again looking incredibly bleak. The Pan Am deal had not yet been concluded despite Kiwi's attempt at rushing it through following the DOT's announcement. Kiwi had liabilities of $35 million and had made a net loss of $21 million for the year before and was losing money every day it was grounded, though probably losing less money than if it were actually flying. The deal with Pan Am fell through. Once the FAA had said that Kiwi would need to reapply for certification as though it was a new airline, it made the whole thing pointless. Why would Pan Am want to acquire Kiwi, take on all that debt for little to no gain? With Pan Am out of the picture, there was no hope for Kiwi. On December 13, 1999, Kiwi's liquidation was approved. So, what went wrong? Wow, where to begin with this one? Starting their own airline rather than buying one certainly seemed like a good idea. After all, most of the airlines that Kiwi were looking at had several issues which had put them into the position where the Kiwi Group could acquire them. When Kiwi first started operating, they had a sensible approach, to stay small enough not to bother the larger carriers. The airline chose its routes wisely, taking on one large carrier on each route rather than the same one over and over. The idea was that it would be more expensive for the competition to try and force Kiwi out of business, and it worked well at first. Kiwi had pegged its ticket prices at the lowest restricted fare that the competition was already offering. For example, Newark to Atlanta was $221 with Kiwi and $743 with Delta. United charged $354 to fly from Newark to Orlando versus Kiwi's $234. Kiwi wanted to offer more than just low fares, however. This was a time when the major airlines were making cutbacks both in terms of fleet, staff and of course product. Kiwi wanted to offer a service far better than the competition. By being an employee-owned airline, there would be an extra incentive to provide a superior service, and it showed too. The crews would provide fresh flowers for the onboard lavatories, and there was plenty of positive feedback on the passenger comment cards. The aircraft had fewer seats in the cabin, giving Kiwi passengers much more legroom than the competition. The food was of a higher standard too. Unfortunately, all of these things cost money one way or the other. Less seats means less revenue from ticket sales, though in Kiwi's case they never really achieved a high load factor anyway. Those superior meals were twice the price of the industry average at $6. Despite using the free-engine Boeing 727, Kiwi's seat cost per mile was around 6 cents, which was far lower than the industry average of around 9.5. In theory, it could make a profit from flying its aircraft half empty, which was handy given Kiwi really struggled to get load factors higher than 60 to 65%. While Kiwi had gotten a lot of free publicity as the little airline that could, and the Kiwi staff had been drumming up business by visiting local businesses in an attempt to sway the business traveller to fly with Kiwi, they were missing one crucial thing. Kiwi didn't have a frequent flyer program until much later. The major carriers did, and thus they were able to keep a lot of the business travellers to themselves due to the benefits of said programs. While Kiwi expanded their route network, they neglected to increase the frequencies on core routes. Meanwhile, the competition did just that, throwing the option to use frequent flyer miles to save money, and no wonder Kiwi struggled to tap into the business traveller market. The competition also lowered their prices to match Kiwi's and poached the leisure traveller too. However, they only lowered the prices on the flights scheduled around the same time as a Kiwi flight, whilst retaining the higher fare on the others. By doing that, they were able to subsidise those flights and pretty much cancel out Kiwi's idea of being too expensive for the competition to compete with. The biggest problem with Kiwi, however, was its management and ownership setup. Unlike other companies which have a proper employee stock ownership plan, or ESOP, the Kiwi employees had no say in the running of the company. Their voting rights were instead placed into a voting trust. The trust was made up by a number of pilots who had then appointed themselves to 5-year terms. The trustees could not be ousted without the consent of the shareholders, effectively making them untouchable. The trust would constantly undermine the company chairman as he tried to make changes that he deemed necessary to keep Kiwi alive. According to Iverson, his attempts to axe the unprofitable route to Puerto Rico were resisted. His attempts to offer charter services to bring in extra revenue were sabotaged as well. He claimed that an equity deal worth $7.5 million in exchange for 51% of the airline was rebuffed by the trust, as it would have diluted the shareholders' stake but also weakened the trust's control. There were, of course, personal issues too. Reportedly, Iverson had previously tried to demote or fire 3 members of the trust, and there was ill feeling on all sides. The management structure, or complete lack of it, meant that those in charge of Kiwi were too busy infighting to spot and react to any external threats quickly. Again, according to Iverson, Kiwi was run more like a flying club than an airline, with decisions about aircraft, routes, fares, or just about anything else being practically impossible. There was also the shocking underutilisation of their fleet. Reportedly, the Kiwi 727s were averaging just 10 hours a day in the air. Add to this the alarming rate that the airline burnt through its start-up capital, it was bound to struggle for survival. The airline may have started out with an egalitarian ideology, but in reality it was more of an oligarchy. This would only be addressed when the airline was bought out of bankruptcy by Dr. Edwards and his partners, though it's worth noting that he retained the same upper management group. I say group as they certainly weren't a team. The final nail in the coffin for Kiwi, however, wasn't really down to them. It was the crash of ValueJet 592 and the subsequent media circus around the safety of low-fare airlines. I have no doubt that the larger carriers were also stirring the pot. It's worth noting that Kiwi did have an excellent safety record. However, it had several run-ins with the authorities regarding its pilot training and record keeping. While it's easy to look back and criticise the way Kiwi was controlled by the trust and how one could accuse the employee shareholders of being incredibly paranoid in order to give all of their power to the trust, it is worth remembering that they were mostly ex-Eastern employees. They were fearful of another Frank Lorenzo taking over. By having such a close setup, it prevented a takeover from an undesirable from outside. That made it practically impossible to make any changes and ultimately led to the downfall of Kiwi. But I'll ask you this. Is it really paranoia if they really are out to get you? Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I know it's gone on far too long, so if you did make it to the end, then thanks again. Kiwi had an interesting history. Back in 1995, Anne Murphy wrote a piece entitled Taking the Fall, which gives some insight into the goings-on which may be of interest. Bob Iverson also wrote a book, When Kiwis Flew, The Diary of a Mad Airline Entrepreneur. He did this just a few years ago, though I've not managed to obtain a copy of myself just yet. Thanks again for watching. If you really like the series, then try subscribing. You'll get to see episodes as they're released, and I promise not all of them go on for this long.